और आइए अब आपको सीधा लिए चलते हैं एक प्रेस वार्ता की तरफ।
For the state of the economy, and also additionally we have the finance secretary with us, who may throw some light on the terms of reference of the 16th Finance Commission as well. So before we start the briefing, I request you to keep your phones on silent mode. In the end, there will be a question and answer session. So I hand over the dais first to the CA for his remarks.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here, and my apologies for the confusion, because on my calendar it was mentioned as 6:30, so I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. But I'm very glad that the bench strength on this side of the table has doubled with the presence of Dr. T.V. Somanathan here. Ideally, it would be absolutely fantastic for him to take all your questions on GDP as well as the Finance Commission, but he will be here to make some initial remarks, and then I will take over from him and walk you through the prepared presentation that we have on the state of the economy based on the second quarter GDP growth numbers, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. Over to you.
So I have, the only opening remark I have to make is I am here because I have got questions from many of you about the Finance Commission, terms of reference, etc. And I thought it's very difficult to make sure that I answer each and every one of them individually. So I have, with the consent of the CA, I have encroached upon this presentation to be able to answer questions that you may have on that aspect. Otherwise, on the GDP, it will be the Chief Economic Advisor. So over to you.
Thank you. Now we will start the presentation. As most of you have seen by now, the year-on-year growth in real GDP or in constant prices is 7.6%, higher than the most optimistic projections made by the private sector economists, which was 7.4%. Quite a few of them had numbers of 7% and slightly above. 7.4 was the highest estimate, but this came in at the slightly above the top end of those estimates. As you can see here, the economy has been fairly maintaining a very steady momentum since the recovery from COVID in FY22. Next slide. In terms of international comparison, we do have a GDP growth number in real terms, which is higher than many other countries have experienced in their calendar second quarter or their calendar third quarter. And that has been the trend we have seen in the last several quarters as well. Next slide. Bulk of the growth has been driven, as you can see, some of you have been mentioning it already, I understand. Bulk of this growth has come from the growth in industry, manufacturing, mining, utility production, etc. As we all know from monthly data, which we already have all the way until October, external trade has been a challenge, but nonetheless in October we know that merchandise export growth picked up, services sector growth also picked up, and because of the collapse in the value of our imports, overall trade deficit in the first 7 months of the year is under control. But we know that in the challenging global environment, which you saw in the previous slide in terms of growth rates elsewhere, it is not a surprise that external trade has not yet repeated the performance we saw in FY22. Next slide. If you look at the Rabi sowing compared to the last 5 years average, it is slightly higher. We know that compared to last year, it's slightly on the lower side. Fertilizer availability is no constraint, and bank credit to the agricultural sector is growing at almost near 20%. And the food grain production estimate for FY23, the fourth estimate, is higher than FY22. And notwithstanding the slight shortfall we have seen in the northeast monsoon, Rabi sowing has been quite good, as we see on the slide in the top left as well. And procurement of rice and wheat are on schedule, which means there is enough availability of food grains so that there is no price shock to consumers. Next slide. As we mentioned, the growth has been driven by the industrial sector. You see in the continuing expansion in the purchasing managers index in the manufacturing sector, both the index of industrial production and the index of core industries are growing at high single digits. And if you look at steel consumption, which is one of the obviously leading indicators of overall construction activity as well as investment activity, that has been rising, and cement production on the right hand side as an index, it is on the lower side, but it is growing year on year. And increasing manufacturing activity is also reflected in the steady and also slightly improving railway freight traffic, which is the monthly data as you see on the bottom right. Next slide, please. Services sector sustains its expansion, hovering near the high 50s, and digital transactions volume is a well-known story, has been rising month after month. And in terms of the average daily rate and revenue available per room grew in September, and the occupancy rate has held steady in terms of the tourism and hospitality sector. Foreign tourist arrivals is catching up. Definitely, if you look at the trend from April 2023, it has been on the slight upswing, and even though it is slightly below the average pre-pandemic level, of course, interest cost and cost of living have also gone up quite a bit in many foreign economies as well. And also in Near East, you have other economies continuing to battle low growth, etc. And therefore, it is not a surprise that the foreign tourist arrivals is holding slightly below the pre-pandemic average. Next slide. Urban demand conditions, in terms of, we all know the data from the festival season as well. Urban passenger vehicle sales posted impressive growth in October. Housing sales picked up in the first 2 quarters as well, and domestic air passenger traffic, in contrast to the foreign travel, domestic air passenger traffic is above the pre-pandemic level, and it has been so almost for the last 1 year. And a surge in credit and debit card spending in October also reflects increased optimism on the part of these consumers about their income and employment prospects, and to be able to incur such credit card and debit card spending. Next slide. In terms of recovery in rural demand, we would like to point out that the green bar on the top left, after staging a slight recovery in Q4 of FY23, it has continued in Q1 and Q2 of the current financial year as well. And this slide and this chart on the top right, I have shared this with you when I made the presentation in end of August. So it is not new information, but nonetheless the new information will come only in December. The Sea Water Survey of Consumer Optimism, which does poll urban and rural consumers. What you see here is that I repeat this information from the August presentation, that in the 3 months preceding the survey done in August, rural consumers actually, or rural households, have said that they have gone on a holiday more than urban households have done, and the percentage is more than double, have purchased a gadget which is almost 11% more than what urban households said, and their income has gone up. Rural households, at least 4.3% of rural respondents were more than the urban respondents in terms of saying that their income has gone up. So it is not something that is perception, it is survey driven, and contrary to the popular perception, rural consumers have done better. This was of course in the survey undertaken in August. The new one will be released sometime in December, and we will be able to update you the next time we meet on this. Bottom left, the 2 and 3 wheeler sales are on a rising trajectory, and there is significant increase in tractor sales in October. So by and large, the picture of rural demand is that it is steady, even if it is not spectacular. Next slide, please. Headline and core inflation continue to decline. We all must have seen the RBI November monthly bulletin, the state of the economy, where they do flag some risk of uptick in food price inflation in November and December, but the overall inflation profile for FY24 remains close to 5%. RBI hasn't made any changes to its inflation forecast, and by and large, the trend in inflation numbers is comfortable. Wholesale price inflation remains in negative territory, partly because of the big surge we saw in commodity prices in the first half of FY23. Next slide, please. Slowing global demand moderates merchandise exports, and strong domestic demand keeps imports high. But as I mentioned to you, this was to be expected earlier, but nonetheless, in value terms, I think the trade deficit is well within the safe parameters, and so is the case of the current account deficit as well, which you will see in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, the current account deficit is narrowing. In fact, for the full financial year, FY24, it should come in at or around below 2% of GDP. Services sector, even though the overall growth in the service sector exports has been almost level, but imports have come down. That is why the net services surplus has continued to creep upwards rather than remaining stagnant or even going down. Net FPI flows compared to the previous financial year have turned positive in a very big way, compared to minus 7.2 in the first 7 months of FY23, minus $7.2 billion. It's been up $14.7 billion, and the forex reserves cover more than 10 months of imports based on current numbers. Next slide. In terms of fiscal management, you can see that the average in the previous 5 years in terms of fiscal deficit as a percentage of budget estimates in the first 6 months of the financial year, first 7 months rather, was 81.6%. Last year, it was already much lower at 45.6%, and this year it has been only 45% of the overall projected fiscal deficit. So fiscal management remains on track. Next slide, please. This is very important. Tax buoyancy. If you look at the combined indirect and direct taxes collection, if you look at the first half of the current financial year, the growth is 16.3%, and nominal GDP growth in the first half has been about 8.6%. That translates into a buoyancy of 1.9, because these are real numbers and GDP is an estimate. So either we talk about the buoyancy being close to 2, because if you recall, the budget numbers assumed nominal GDP growth of 10.5% for the full financial year, and revenue growth also was assumed at around the same level. So in fact, therefore, these numbers tell us, based on the first half experience, that the buoyancy is close to 2, or that we are probably still underestimating our GDP growth and economic activity. Contrary to several prejudices which masquerade as opinions, the truth could very well be that India's GDP growth may be, based on our current statistics, we may be understating them rather than overstating them. Next slide, please. The focus on capital expenditure leading to improved quality of spending is very obvious. Both states and the union government have upped their capital spending. Last year's surge was much higher, but this year's surge is no less impressive compared to historical trends. And in terms of the revenue to capital outlay ratio, as you see on the chart on the right, it has been coming down steadily, which means the overall quality of expenditure is focusing much more than in the past on capex rather than on revenue expenditure. Next slide, please. In terms of the private sector investment activity, we rely on indicators such as the rise in the import of capital goods and the rise in the increased production of capital infrastructure goods from the IIP. We are seeing clear uptrends. And again, if you look at the RBI's monthly bulletin of November, in the first chapter on state of the economy, they clearly point out the fundraisings done by the private sector are 60% higher in the first half of the current financial year than they were in the second half of the last financial year. Next slide, please. And the combined order books of capital goods and engineering firms surpassed 8 lakh crores in the second quarter of FY24. And on the right side, you see the companies whose order books are mentioned there. So clearly, if you look at these three charts from the previous slide and this slide, it gives you a clear picture that, and along with the information from the Reserve Bank of India on fundraising by the private sector for capital expenditure, they tell us a story of private sector capital formation is not an aircraft that is waiting for takeoff, but has already started to move and fly. Next slide, please. We are very familiar with these numbers. I don't want to spend more time on this since the data are pertaining to as of March 2023. We do have a banking sector that has now the potential and the willingness to lend, and the borrowing side, both businesses as well as individuals have the confidence to borrow, both sets of players having put behind them their balance sheet issues of the last decade. Next slide, please. And credit growth, of course, some of the hockey stick representation is partly due to the merger of HDFC and HDFC Bank. But even without that, you have had a fairly strong credit growth. At the same time, as the Honorable Finance Minister has said, the Reserve Bank of India's decision to increase the risk weights on personal loans is to combine growth with prudence so that we are stronger for longer. Next slide, please. Based on the recent periodic labor force survey, which came out yesterday, the overall unemployment rate has come down to 6.6%. And of course, we have the data for the full country up to March 2023, where the overall unemployment rate, including rural, has come down as well. The net payroll additions have been showing average net payroll addition under the Employee Provident Fund organization has been stepping up year after year, and that is what you see on the chart on your right. Next slide, please. So overall, investment and consumer momentum will underpin solid growth prospects in the current financial year as well as in the next financial year. The private sector, as I mentioned, based on data, is poised to continue to invest in the economy following the strengthening of corporate and bank balance sheets. Expansion of the public digital platforms and path-breaking measures such as PM Gati Shakti, the National Logistics Policy, and the Production-Led Incentive Scheme will continue to boost manufacturing output, as you saw in the data for second quarter GDP. We are not mindless, or we are mindful rather, of the risk factors that we need to watch, and we are watching them. There is uncertainty on merchandise trade because of slow growth in global trade and because of continued uncertainties on global demand. But nonetheless, it also is reflecting in reduced value terms of Indian imports, and crude oil prices, Brent crude particularly, is hovering at levels very close to $80 per barrel, and therefore we are comfortable notwithstanding tepid growth in merchandise and services exports. But we'll continue to keep a watch on the Brent crude oil price. Prolonged geopolitical uncertainty and tightening financial conditions, which are in a way yet to materialize if you look at the stock market ebullience in the developed world, as and when they materialize, they may pose some challenges because of their implications on sentiment, etc. But be that as it may, if you look at the next slide, you can see the momentum in terms of economic activity. In current financial year, in terms of the last column on both in the two boxes, there are no red boxes, because the green boxes highlights the highest value of the tree, and the yellow boxes are the second. But the point is, either we are growing very strongly or we are growing very moderately if you look at several indicators of economic activity. Next slide. In terms of the projections, therefore, obviously these numbers impart a certain upside to the 6.5% estimate for real GDP growth in the current financial year, but we will have to work the numbers to see what kind of upside that this current numbers impart for the full year estimate. So until then, we will keep the estimate at 6.5%, except to signal that we are now probably more comfortable with this number than we were before. Next slide. If you look at the the key points that the Reserve Bank of India, if you look at the key point the Reserve Bank of India made in its November bulletin, I think there is a lot of reference to rural demand or MSMEs, etc., without recourse to data. So here we have the central bank which looks at these data and telling us that MSMEs supplying to in-demand segments are experiencing not just a growth but a surge in orders, particularly from businesses selling through platforms and large format stores. So some of the reforms we have undertaken over the last 6-7 years are beginning to manifest themselves in terms of better economic activity even for micro, small and medium enterprises. Nearly half of the credit demand is originating from tier 3 cities. That's also important to remember. No longer is the growth dominated by big and medium-sized cities. Investment in the private sector is beginning to pick up, as I mentioned, and during H1 23-24, funds raised for capex were 60% higher than during H2 of 22-23. More than 2/3 of the export basket registered year-on-year growth in the month of October. So it is not as if investment or economic activity is concentrated in a few players and a few segments. What these verbatim quotes from the RBI State of the Economy chapter from November 23 monthly bulletin tell us is that economic activity has diffused and percolated down to many segments of the economy, which gives us confidence about the numbers going forward. And I would also like to mention to you that we are already 2 months into the third quarter of the fiscal, and as we saw in the festival season, the numbers are indicating that the momentum of economic growth has continued in the third quarter as well. I end my presentation here. Now the floor is yours for questions.
Thank you, sir, for your in-depth analysis of the state of economy and also highlighting the various sectors and factors which are at play to reflect the surge in GDP. So now we open the floor to question and answers. Sapna, please start with you.
Sir, 2 questions packed into one. So one, you are saying that there is an upside to 6.5% this year. You are confident in coming to the number, but you are not changing the forecast as of now. Give us an indication as to why not. And that one is that. And second thing, you said that we may be understating India's GDP more in nominal terms rather than real terms, because the fact remains that nominal growth is much lower Y-on-Y and also lower than your B that you kept at 10.5% H1 as of now. So is there a worry on that one? I mean, pros and cons.
No, there is no worry on that account. If anything, I'm simply stating the fact that there are 2 possibilities. Either the tax buoyancy is very high, or it could very well be the case that we are still, the economic activity in actual terms is more than what we are estimating. And obviously, if we are saying that the real economic activity is higher in nominal terms, it would also mean that economic activity will be greater in constant prices as well. Now, as for not revising the GDP growth numbers, we got the 7.6% about an hour or so ago. So obviously, we need to work out the numbers and see what kind of upside it imparts to the overall estimate for the year. So at the moment, all it means is that we are comfortable with 6.5%, much more comfortable with 6.5% than before.
Leaning more towards 7,
I don't want to say any number without working them out.
Sir, Sumit Chakravarti now, can you throw some more light on the rural demand as well, like what impact of monsoon has been visible on rural demand, also on the currency side, sir, what kind of impact of currency considering today rupee has touched another record low as far as this is concerned?
So, as far as rural demand is concerned, you saw in the festival season data as well that 2-wheeler sales has picked up, so have 3-wheeler sales. And I also showed you in terms of the FMCG products, the slight recovery we saw in the fourth quarter of last financial year here has continued. And I also shared with you actual statements made by rural households. And in terms of the rupee value, obviously, it is very difficult. In fact, I used to tell my students that anything less than 3-year horizon, you are better off flipping a coin and deciding which way the currency moves. So, and only more than 3 years. So, it is very difficult to comment on day-to-day movements and try to make economic sense out of them. So, I wouldn't worry about them.
Sir,
Next.
I just wanted to...
Please introduce yourself.
Sunil Prabhu.
Yes, still.
Sir, 2 questions, and this is for Finance Secretary as well as you. On the GDP, you said it's under control. comparison with 5 years and so on and so forth, fiscal deficit. How are you going to tackle this? Because yesterday the cabinet took a decision for 2.36 lakh crores every year on year with a 5 to 7% increase for the next 5 years. There's also crude oil which you caused an concern. So I would like to know whether that target of this year will be met because it's an election year, and how are you going to deal with the various other demands that are coming in, especially in the next quarter?
Sure. So, as you said, it's an election year. It's not a snap election. So we knew it was an election year when we started. No, nothing has happened so far to change the assumption that we will end this year with a fiscal deficit of approximately 5.9%. So, as of now, nothing has happened to change that assumption, and
आप देख रहे थे नई दिल्ली से सीधा प्रसारण, जहां वित्त वर्ष 2024 के जीडीपी की दूसरी तिमाही का अनुमान जारी किया गया है। वित्त सचिव और मुख्य आर्थिक सलाहकार प्रेस वार्ता को संबोधित कर रहे थे। इस मौके पर उन्होंने कहा कि जीडीपी यानी कि सकल घरेलू उत्पाद की दूसरी तिमाही का जो अनुमान जारी किया गया है उसमें 7.6% की वृद्धि दर्ज की गई है, जो पिछले वर्ष की दूसरी तिमाही के हिसाब से इसमें अभूतपूर्व इजाफा हुआ है। उन्होंने बताया कि कोविड के बाद जो हमारी अर्थव्यवस्था है वो बहुत ही स्टेबल रही है। इस मौके पर मुख्य आर्थिक सलाहकार वी अनंत नागेश्वरन ने बताया कि किस तरीके से जो अर्थव्यवस्था है उसमें वृद्धि आ रही है। साथ ही उन्होंने बताया कि जो हमारे व्यापार है उसमें वृद्धि आई है और साथ ही व्यापार घाटा जो है वो नियंत्रण में है। हमारे संवाददाता अजय मिश्रा मौजूद है ज़्यादा जानकारी के साथ। अजय, स्वागत आपका। जिस तरीके से अभी जो आंकड़े, जो अनुमान जारी किए गए हैं वो बहुत ही अनुकूल, बहुत ही वृद्धि दिखाने वाले आंकड़े हैं। 7.6% की वृद्धि जीडीपी के दूसरी तिमाही में क्या देखा जाए, किस तरीके से अर्थव्यवस्था जो है वो लगातार उसका ग्राफ बढ़ता जा रहा है?
जारी किए गए हैं वो उम्मीद से कहीं बेहतर नजर आते हैं। मुझे याद आता है एक बयान जो कि आरबीआई गवर्नर ने करीब 1 महीने पहले दिया था। उन्होंने ये कहा था कि हालांकि आरबीआई ने 6.5% की विकास दर का अनुमान दूसरी तिमाही के लिए लगाया है, लेकिन जो एक्चुअल आंकड़े आएंगे वो सबको चौंका सकते हैं जी। तो इसका कोई न कोई आधार जरूर होता है जब आरबीआई गवर्नर इतनी बड़ी बात कहते हैं, और तब से लोगों ने ये उम्मीद लगाना शुरू किया था कि शायद उम्मीद से बेहतर आंकड़े हो सकते हैं। तो जो एक औसत अनुमान था कि 6.5 से लेकर के 7.2% की ही विकास दर शायद हमें दूसरी तिमाही में दिखाई देगी, लेकिन ये सभी अनुमानों को पार करते हुए 7.6% की जो वृद्धि दर है उसने शायद अब दुनिया के जितने भी अनुमान करने वाली एजेंसीज हैं अब उनको शायद फिर से भारत के बारे में कुछ और पॉजिटिव आउटलुक करने पर विवश कर देगा, जैसा कि पहली तिमाही के आंकड़ों ने किया था। 7.8% का आंकड़ा पहली तिमाही में था, और उसके बाद कई सारी जो वैश्विक एजेंसियां हैं उनको भारत के अनुमान को लेकर के अपने जो अनुमान थे उसमें संशोधन करना पड़ा था। IMF हो, चाहे वर्ल्ड बैंक हो, या फिर मूडीज, S&P ग्लोबल और दूसरी रेटिंग एजेंसीज थी, सभी ने जो विकास का अनुमान है उसमें संशोधन किया था और कहा था कि दुनिया की सबसे बड़ी तेजी से रफ्तार से बढ़ने वाली भारत की अर्थव्यवस्था है। दूसरी तिमाही के आंकड़े भी वैसे ही नजर आ रहे हैं। अगर आप डिटेलिंग में जाएं तो थोड़ा सा खेती बाड़ी में सुस्ती जरूर नजर आ रही है, लेकिन मैन्युफैक्चरिंग जिसमें सबसे ज्यादा रोजगार उत्पन्न होता है और सेवा क्षेत्र, उसने बेहतरीन प्रदर्शन किया है। सीमेंट, कोल और मतलब कोयला, सीमेंट और जो कंस्ट्रक्शन का काम है उसमें बहुत तेजी दिखाई दी है। तो जो रोजगार से संबंधित आंकड़े हैं वो बहुत आकर्षक छवि इस वक्त दिखा रहे हैं। खेती बाड़ी में सुस्ती जरूर नजर आ रही है, जो कि कहा जा सकता है कि 1.1% की विकास दर बहुत अच्छी नहीं कही जा सकती, लेकिन अच्छी खबर यह भी है कि जो बुनियादी ढांचे में सरकार का निवेश है वो लगातार बढ़ रहा है, और हमने देखा है कि पिछले कई सालों से लगातार जो ग्रॉस फिक्स्ड कैपिटल फॉर्मेशन होता है, जो देश की बुनियादी ढांचे में निवेश का एक बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण कारक होता है, उसमें जो वृद्धि देखने को मिल रही है, इसका मतलब कि लंबी अवधि के लिए हम भारत की बुनियाद को तैयार कर रहे हैं। इसलिए ये आंकड़े बहुत ही मजबूत हो जाते हैं। जितने हाई इंडिकेटर्स हैं, चाहे वो दोपहिया वाहनों की बिक्री हो, पैसेंजर कार्स की बिक्री हो, या फिर देश में खपत हो पानी और बिजली की, उन सब में दहाई के आंकड़े में आपको वृद्धि देखने को मिली। और इस बार तो मैन्युफैक्चरिंग ने सबको चौंका दिया है। 14% की वृद्धि अभी तक शानदार दर्ज की गई है, और आज ही IIP के जो आंकड़े आए हैं 8 कोर सेक्टर्स के, उसने भी एक बेहतरीन प्रदर्शन का रुख जारी रखा है। तो उम्मीद ये की जा रही है कि आगे आने वाले समय में भारत की अर्थव्यवस्था का प्रदर्शन और भी बेहतर हो सकता है और दुनिया की सबसे तेज रफ्तार अर्थव्यवस्था का तमगा फिलहाल भारत के पास ही रहने वाला है।
बिल्कुल अजय, साथ ही जो मुख्य बातें मुख्य आर्थिक सलाहकार ने कही उसमें एक मुख्य बात थी डिजिटल लेन देन की। और डिजिटल लेन देन में उन्होंने कहा कि दर पर दर महीने दर महीने डिजिटल लेन देन जो है उसमें इजाफा आ रहा है, साथ ही साथ व्यापार में वृद्धि हो रही है। तो कितना बड़ा कदम जो है नरेंद्र मोदी सरकार ने ये उठाया है जिससे हमारी जो डिजिटल इकॉनमी है वो और मजबूत होती जा रही है।
देखिए, जो डिजिटल इकोनॉमी है उस पर तो पूरी दुनिया की निगाहें हैं। जिस तरह से हमने देखा G20 के दौरान डिजिटल पब्लिक इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर को लेकर के पूरी दुनिया ने भारत की जो मॉडल है उसको सराहा और अब तो हमने एक ग्लोबल फाइनेंशियल रिपोजिटरी भी बनाने का सुझाव दिया है जिसका फायदा ग्लोबल साउथ को मिलेगा। उसी डेटा का इस्तेमाल करते हुए विकासशील देश अपने विकास के दूसरे जो आयाम है उसको तय करते हुए नजर आएंगे। तो भारत की डिजिटल इकोनॉमी पर पूरी दुनिया की निगाहें हैं, उसमें कोई दो राय नहीं और एक सफलतम फैक्टर्स में कहा जा सकता है आज के लिहाज से। लेकिन आप देखिए कि आर्थिक वृद्धि के साथ साथ जो वित्त सचिव साहब ने एक बात कही कि हम लोग फिस्कल डेफिसिट के जो टारगेट्स हैं, जो हमारे जो वित्तीय घाटे का जो टारगेट है उस पर हम स्टिक करेंगे। ये बहुत बड़ा संदेश है निवेशकों के लिए कि ये स्थायित्व की तरफ हम आगे बढ़ रहे हैं। कोई ऐसे डिसीजंस नहीं हो रहे हैं जो कि अर्थव्यवस्था में अस्थिरता पैदा करें। जहां पूरी दुनिया में महंगाई सबसे ज्यादा है, जहां पूरी दुनिया में वित्तीय स्थिरता काफी डावाडोल है, हमने कई बड़े देशों में खासतौर पर यूरोप और अमेरिका में कई बड़े बैंक फेल होते हुए देखे। भारत की अर्थव्यवस्था में जो स्थिरता है, यहाँ की जो मजबूत बुनियाद है, इसको फंडामेंटल आप कहते हैं, इकोनॉमी के फंडामेंटल बहुत ही स्ट्रांग है और ये विश्वसनीयता पूरी दुनिया में जो निवेशक है उनके लिए बहुत ही बड़ी एक आश्वासन का आधार साबित होता है। और उम्मीद की जा सकती है कि आने वाले दिनों में जो थोड़े सी निवेश में कमी आई है, FIIs के निवेश में शेयर बाजार की बात करें या फिर दूसरे तरीकों से, उसमें और ज्यादा वृद्धि होगी क्योंकि भारत का भरोसा अब और ज्यादा बढ़ने जा रहा है बाहर के निवेशकों के लिए, जो कि हमारे लिए भी अच्छी खबर है।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया अजय, इतनी महत्वपूर्ण जानकारी हम तक साझा करने के लिए। तो अभी फिलहाल ताज़ा जानकारी ये है कि सकल घरेलू उत्पाद के वर्ष 2024 की दूसरी तिमाही के आंकड़े जारी कर दिए गए हैं जिसमें 7.6% की वृद्धि दर्ज की गई है।